Put me in, coach. I'm ready to play. It's 10-Yard Fight, episode 15 of Good Intentions. As we near the end of this chronology of the NES's initial 1985 release lineup, we have a few games that appeared in Japan mere months before the American console launch. Like the system itself, American localizations of games could sometimes take years to arrive following the Japanese debut of those titles, so the quick turnaround of these games makes them particularly noteworthy. With GYROMITE and StackUp, you had two games designed specifically for the American launch. Rob was a novel afterthought in Japan, and Nintendo rushed to complete the peripheral and a couple of games, or arguably not complete them when it came to the seemingly unfinished StackUp. Irem's 10-Yard Fight seems like a more complicated case, logistically speaking, as it was a third-party game. Nintendo kept a tight rein over NES game production in the US, but in Japan, publishers could roll their own, at least at the beginning. 10-Yard Fight publisher Irem was one of those companies that made the most of the freedom afforded by the fact that Nintendo hadn't yet tightened its grip on manufacturing processes for Famicom carts as of 1985. They distinguished their early Famicom cartridges from others by adding a small red LED to the case that would light up when played. Unlike the NES, the Famicom was a top-loading console, so playing an Irem title gave your Famicom a little extra pizzazz. But this meant, presumably, Nintendo had to work quickly to get 10-Yard Fight into the US launch lineup. The game debuted in Japan at the very end of August 1985, a mere 6 or 7 weeks before the NES's initial release. Of course, it made perfect sense that Nintendo would take whatever pains were necessary to get 10-Yard Fight out the door in time for the US launch. Of every game in the initial NES lineup, 10-Yard Fight was by far the most idiosyncratically suited for American tastes. This has nothing to do with quality or game design, of course, and instead simply reflects the nature of the subject at hand: American football. Japan is one of the few countries in the world that seems willing to even give the time of day to the rugby variant that Americans gave the name of a completely different European sport, so it's not too surprising that the NES's first adaptation of football would come from a Japanese developer and a Japanese publisher. It's also no surprise that Nintendo looked at its lineup of games that featured, for example, tubby Eskimos rescuing eggplants, or interactive robots crushing carnivorous birds with a predilection for radishes, and said, "We need to Yankee this up, pronto." And so 10-Yard Fight got a place of honor at the NES launch, one of 4 sports titles for the system, 5 if you count Excitebike, and the only one to originate outside of Nintendo. Irem had debuted 10-Yard Fight as an arcade release in 1984, one with a somewhat unusual premise for the sport. Players simply played offense rather than alternating between offense and defense, hence the title. The game consisted of a series of fights to gain 10 yards for a first down and ultimately reach the end zone to score. In other words, it somehow managed to be even more stripped down than Atari's 1978 football, the one where everything was rendered in monochrome X's and O's. But its simple and energetic score attack design worked well in arcades, offering a quick, fast-paced approximation of football. For the Nintendo release, however, Irem retooled the game from top to bottom. While the offensive play design remained more or less the same, the home version adds alternating sides and a 2-player option. In the arcade, 10-Yard Fight simply penalized players with a loss of yardage for failing to earn a first down or allowing an interception. On Nintendo, however, these setbacks allow the CPU, or second player, to take possession of the ball and attempt to undertake their own 10-yard fight. The field rotates 180 degrees based on current possession, so that the offense always appears at the bottom of the screen, driving upward toward the end zone above. This being an 8-bit team-based sport game, 10-Yard Fight involves an awful lot of shortcuts and simplifications. For example, when you receive the ball, your team charges ahead as a unit. As offense, you basically just control the quarterback. As defender, you press A or B to take control of either a single cornerback or a single safety. You have no control over your formations, no way to determine which 2 specific defenders the game will allow you to control. And as offense, you guide the quarterback until he tosses the ball to one of his teammates, whose movements are determined by the CPU until the moment of reception. It's a very hands-off kind of game that relies heavily on AI. And perhaps not surprisingly, the computer gives itself tremendous advantages. Obviously, the computer controls its entire lineup as well as yours, and it seems to enjoy much greater precision over how its quarterback passes and who receives. It also has a tendency to launch successive chains of passes, with a quarterback tossing to a running back who then passes forward to a wide receiver, something that's both illegal and extremely difficult for a player to do manually with any success. The CPU also has a tendency to bend circumstances to its own advantage. For example, interceptions are pretty rare in 10-Yard Fight, but mysteriously, the game has a tendency to allow me to intercept passes at the very end of the first half, which of course allows the CPU to take possession of the ball at the beginning of the second half. This isn't simply a case of me being terrible at the game and complaining that the computer cheats. No, it's well documented that Irem didn't fine-tune the AI in adapting it from the arcade's single-player offense-only format, and the second player in the NES version enjoys a lot of unfair advantages over the first because they also benefit from human intelligence and the CPU team's AI cheats. 10-Yard Fight seems hilariously dated compared to modern football games, or even versus Tecmo Bowl, which would arrive a few years later on NES. It is to football games what Bogoska Wars was to real-time strategy. Heck, the offensive formation as you're returning the ball even kind of resembles Bogoska Wars' army movements. Like much of the NES launch lineup, 10-Yard Fight was not a revolution in game design, and wouldn't have any real impact on the future of the medium. But it served its purpose, which was giving Americans a loose approximation of an indigenous sport on day one of the system's life, and I suppose that's good enough. Next time on Good Intentions, 1985 comes to an end with the killer app.